Hi, this is Forrest Winstead doing my Deana Thompson, hoping for more presentation with my case study and paper. Um, just going to go through one at a time, sort of talking about it. I have the case study pulled up on my phone just for reference. So if you see me looking down, that's why I have that. But Deana Thompson, hoping for more. I really enjoyed the book. I thought it was a really interesting reflection on grief and grieving and sort of the way that people who are sick grieve while they are alive, which I think is not something that we discuss very often. Even if they do get better, there is a certain component of grief that they have to tangle with for a lot of their sort of like time in the hospital and time receiving treatment, and the way that that can overwhelm you. For my quote, I quoted the discussion of her gentleman friend who was running the cancer marathon with her when she was talking about how his wife had passed away. And his quiet refusal to let grief over his wife's death have the last word. He graced me with one of the most powerful visions of hope I've been given thus far. He carried the grief and sorrow of his wife's loss through those many miles, and at the same time, he moved forward using his feet to be a blessing to me and to others. And I thought that quote was very powerful and sort of getting into why that is powerful. You reflect a lot on sort of the weight, and I'll go into weight in a little bit, but the weight that you end up having to carry and having to deal with a lot when you're a healthcare worker. There's a lot of reflection on the things that you see and sort of that small ability for this person who is in such a tragic position to reflect on her own sort of experience with someone else's grace through grief and being able to apply that to her life, whether that be secular or otherwise, is very powerful, I think, um, because it's sort of he is being an exemplar of how you shoulder that load and deal with those problems, which so we sort of get into with the case study that I wrote. So the case study I wrote for a young gentleman, 9 years old, named Anthony Jones. Anthony Jones is a leukemia, acute lymphoblastic leukemia patient whose cancer recently metastasized to his lungs. He's on the acute care floor of an oncology clinic. His family is currently present, and he has a little sister, Lily. There is a lot of care that needs to be done for this family. First and foremost, as you'll note in my case study, mom and dad are not only at odds on what they want to do in terms of treatment, they are at odds in terms of the way that they are treating young Anthony. They are arguing a lot in the room. They have a little girl with them who is sort of pulled out of her academics, pulled out of her activities. They're pulling uh, themselves out of church to be in sort of the hospital with Anthony while they're taking care of him and while undergoing chemo and radiation therapy. I think that there needs to be a certain amount of care done in this case study to address not only sort of the fundamental gaps in quality of care for Anthony when it comes to receiving care from his parents. I think that is something that needs to be discussed with the provider and with the nursing, and something we could do there was to be able to sort of talk to each parent one on one and say, maybe let's not have arguments about his care and the fact that he could be dying in the room. It doesn't really seem like an appropriate thing to do. Talk to Anthony's father, say, I understand, Liam, that you're very upset with his care and his progression. Why do you feel like that isn't something that should move forward? Why do you feel like he should be taken off of these things? And then talk to his mom and say, I know he's suffering a lot going through these therapies, and sort of how do you feel about it? Why do you feel like he should continue? I know he's your little boy. And then from there, you could also talk to Anthony and say, how do you feel you're doing? Do you feel like this is too much? Because although he does not have the durable power of attorney, the patient wish is most important, even in pediatric settings. I would argue, especially in pediatric settings. Um, and then also talking to the little girl and making sure that she's not having some of those pediatric developmental milestones where she feels like her brother is sick and it's somehow her fault, or it's somehow something that she needs to deal with on a sort of case by case basis and things like that. Definitely, I think a chaplain consult is in order. I know that the grandparents are in and out of this case, but I think that you could definitely have a like chaplain come in and say a prayer or offer like a small service or see if there is a religious facility in the hospital where there are services being held that maybe Anthony could go down to because he was missing out on Sunday school with his friends. Um, those are some of the outside of medical things we can do to sort of provide spiritual care and social care for that family. It definitely seems like a difficult. I kind of wrote myself a pretty rough one all the way around, but then going into sort of what I was talking about with that quote, I really think Deanna Thompson nails on the head the concept of grieving while living. And I'm going to sort of cite this into my own life and my own media interpretation. And this is going to sound really silly, but go with me here. If there's a show called Cowboy Bebop that is about being unable to move on, and sort of the core thesis of the show is that as long as you are stuck, not being able to move on, you are unable to progress not only as a person, but progress your life in the ways that you need to do so. And Deanna Thompson illustrates a lot of the same points about, sort of where she's at mentally with her chemotherapy and her breast cancer and how she feels like she's pigeonholed into this idea of always grieving all the time. And sort of very beautifully, like the quote says at the end of Cowboy Bebop, there's a reference to the Beatles album, or specifically one quote from a Beatles album, and it just says in all black text on a all white text on a black screen. It just says, "You're going to carry that weight," which is something that I've actually considered getting like postered or something like that because it's a really nice send off of the series where the main character ends up moving on with his life and it ends up having him die because he decided to move on with his life. The concept that they're narratively pursuing, which is the same concept that Deana is narratively pursuing, which is why I enjoyed reading this book so much, is the concept that no matter what you're doing, no matter if you succeed getting through your chemotherapy, you fail. No matter if you progress to the next step of your life or you rescind. And it's especially as healthcare workers, no matter if your patient lives or dies, you are going to carry the emotional, spiritual, physical, sometimes weight of having cared for them and being able to understand that burden as part of the calling of healthcare is something that I think is very important, not only just the burden on the healthcare worker taking care of that person, but also the burden on the person who's experiencing that illness and that grief. Thank you very much.